everybody to. I would like to welcome everybody to the to the call today. The lay Augustinians of the province of St. Thomas of Villanova. What are we? I think many of you are familiar, but perhaps not all. So the Augustinian order has three components: our friars, of course, contemplative nuns, and the rest of us, the laity, who through our daily lives participate in living a life according to the rule of St. Augustine and being part of the Augustinian laity. So the third part of the Augustinian order, within the province, we work very hard to create community at the parish level, the school level, and virtually. And so we have folks joining today from all over the country, all over the world, actually. And I welcome you all. And I'm extraordinarily pleased and grateful that we have Kevin Bergdorf, who I met through being a lay Augustinian. And he, I think, is an example to all of us in terms of our ongoing call to holiness. So he is a distinguished entrepreneur and business owner who then progressed through graduate studies at Catholic University and then Oxford in England, studying Latin and Augustine, and is a genuine scholar in all things related to Augustine, but particularly confessions, and has agreed to lead for us a recurring series monthly throughout the rest of this year to walk us through the confessions, which is an extraordinary gift of God through Augustine. However, it sometimes takes a little bit of a hand holding to walk through and really appreciate all of the nuances of it. So I want to thank Kevin, and I also want to thank Madonna Sutter and the entire communication staff within the province for doing all of this. And then without anything further, I will ask us all just to offer a brief Hail Mary for for all of us who are joined together today, and for that this time may be fruitful for all of us today and as we work through the rest of the year with this and other programming which we will offer as well. So please, in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace.
Full of grace, the Lord is
with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now at the hour of death. Amen. St. Rita, pray for us. St. Monica, pray for us. St. Augustine, pray for us. Thank you all again for joining. And I am going to now mute myself and introduce Kevin Bergdorf, who is going to lead us through the confessions. Thank you. And Kevin, please take it away.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, thrilled to be here. The response to this is overwhelming. Had great opportunities in the past to lead groups through a study of the confessions. This by far is the largest audience that has expressed this kind of interest. So Jim's excited. I know I'm excited. I do want to say one thing before we get into this. So yes, I was at Catholic University of America. Yes, my day job is teaching Latin and some other subjects at Lake Catholic High School. But I do feel like it's important from the outset to say that my own interest in St. Augustine and the Confessions actually began with, you can see this. So this is Henry Chadwick's translation. You don't necessarily have to use this one for the course. But this is a book I picked up. We were actually in Massachusetts, my wife and I, serving with the C.S. Lewis Foundation. We were in, I think it was Amherst, Emily Dickinson's hometown, is that right? I went to a used bookstore. I was at a particularly, I think, sensitive moment, a juncture in life spiritually. Picked up a handful of books. One of them was C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy. Another one was this copy of the Confessions, and it did, without exaggeration, without hyperbole, it's a book that changed my life. And so my interest in the Confessions is deeply personal as well as academic. So as we get into working through the text of the Confessions, yes, there is an enormous amount of academic interest in the Confessions. I'll point out the areas that people have been particularly interested in and have spilled a lot of ink on. But fundamentally, the Confessions is a book that Augustine is writing from the heart in a spirit of charity, and really directing this to other spiritual people who will receive it in a spirit of charity. And so just as a kind of a big picture preface before I get into the formal introduction, I hope that helps to get a sense of my attitude and angle on the book and the general drift of the way that this is going to go. So having said that, when we come to a person who is as famous as St. Augustine is, we might ask ourselves the question, well, does St. Augustine even really need an introduction? Like, right, why introducing this guy? Everybody knows who St. Augustine is. In fact, no less a musical genius than Sting, the English singer-songwriter, formerly of the Police, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee, 17-time Grammy winner, wrote a song. The song was entitled St. Augustine in Hell, which is in some sense, I think, English humor and a bit of a clever joke. But for the joke to work, we have to know something. There's got to be something in the air, something in our cultural context where we hear that and we think, oh, St. Augustine in Hell. Like that, no, that doesn't follow. We need to know something for the joke to land. And Sting calculates, and I think calculates correctly, people are going to get the joke. This is not a miscalculation on Sting's part. After all, if Augustine could not get into heaven, who could? Well, Sting says something of interest about this song. He says this in an interview. He said, St. Augustine was reputedly something of a libertine in his younger days, and the phrase, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet, is attributable to him. Sting goes on to say, I prefer the saints in my personal hagiography to have at least some basic human flaws. Otherwise, the concept of sainthood just seems too unobtainable and not particularly interesting for me. That's probably not the commentary that we expected from Sting, but he's actually tapped into something. Being a good artist, he's not telling us how we should feel. He's rather intuiting what we all really feel, putting it into words in a way that's careful and intelligent. What Sting is capturing here is this idea that Augustine is accessible. At some level, when we begin to encounter him, we realize, oh, okay, St. Augustine, this is different. This is not a Thomas Aquinas who, in the entire corpus of his writings, uses the first person personal pronoun I once. Augustine's talking about himself all the time. Sometimes people think he's obnoxiously talking about himself, but Augustine is somebody that people quickly relate to, and they say, okay, this is not a St. John of the Cross. This is not a St. Anthony in the desert. This is not a Thomas Aquinas. This is someone who's fundamentally a basic sinner who has a radical conversion experience that's actually a process. Oh, okay, that's something I get that. Like that I can relate to. And so Sting got this too. Augustine is somebody who's relatable. In terms of cultural references, though, on this side of the pond, Augustine is not unfamiliar to us. We have landmarks with points of reference that should get our attention. After all, there's St. Augustine in Florida, which does rather serve to confuse the question of the pronunciation of Augustine's name. Is it Augustine or is it Augustine? I will not correct you if I happen to hear you say it one way or the other. Generally speaking, Augustine is the man and Augustine is the city. You might ask, well, could we not appeal to the Latin and find something about Augustine's name that would help us with the pronunciation? And unfortunately, this is not the case. What we do know about Augustine, and there's not a huge number of references to his actual name, is that he was known in his time as Aurelius Augustinus. Aurelius was actually a fairly common name in the late Roman Empire. Augustine was an extraordinarily uncommon name in late antiquity. We would be very hard pressed to find anybody else in the ancient world named Augustinus. In fact, the name Augustinus is a diminutive, and it literally means the little Augustus, the little emperor. And so we might ask ourselves, well, what was it that Monica portended? What was it that she thought or understood in the choice of this name for Augustine? Augustinus, the little emperor. Monica's interest in Augustine's worldly success, as well as his ultimate spiritual conversion, is of course legendary. Most of us probably know something about this. Monica's legacy, in fact, lives on in at least two places: the St. Monica Society, as well as the millions of Monicas. Well, what are these? Well, these are support groups. They're support groups for mothers, for parents of wayward children of the faith, who, like Augustine, are sons and daughters of so many tears. But having mentioned St. Augustine in Florida, it is also worth noting that on the Pacific, we have Santa Monica. And so if we give ourselves permission for a moment to wax poetical or mystical, we could say, oh, we have St. Augustine on the Atlantic coast and St. Monica on the West coast. And here they are, mother and son, almost, if we could see it this way, embracing these United States. And this relationship between Monica and Augustine figures very heavily into the narrative of the Confessions. It is one of the most famous mother-son relationships in the world, which is suggestive actually of Augustine's own life, the sort of gospel resonances that just come out unintentionally. So we have Monica and Augustine, and there are parallels. There are some curious points of reference actually back to the mother of our Lord and Christ, because during the public ministry of Christ, Joseph is actually nowhere mentioned. And most of us has probably picked up on this at one point or another. I think it's irresistible. Many biblical scholars assure us that Joseph had actually died before the beginning of Jesus's public ministry. And if we pause and if we thought for a moment, well, what is the last reference to Joseph in the Gospels? Well, likewise, in Augustine's own life, Patricius, his father, dies when Augustine is about 16 years old. Furthermore, in Augustine's life, he has a passion event at about the age of 33. We'll get to this when we get to book 8. Likewise, this passion event, it happens in a garden. It happens at the foot of a tree. Monica is present. This is not the sort of thing Augustine ever describes in any of his writings, but it is the sort of thing we can look at and at least recognize is at least a historical curiosity. So for all of this, Augustine's being immortalized by staying, Augustine being present in our consciousness through the name of the city, and just kind of a general recognition of this very famous person, we might reiterate the question, so what's the point? Do we really need a further introduction to Augustine? But I do feel like there's more to say on this. In fact, when we talk about St. Augustine, we are talking about the one individual from antiquity that we know more about than any other person that lived. We know more about Augustine than Alexander the Great by far. We know more about Augustine than we know about St. Paul. Most of what we can figure out about Paul's life is largely just through inference, the very few personal details that we pick up in his letters and in Acts, and even that most famous Roman of all, Julius Caesar, pales in comparison to the information, the knowledge that we have available to us about Augustine. To this, we might ask the question, well, why is this? How is it possible that we know more about Augustine than we know about Julius Caesar? Everybody knows about Julius Caesar. Well, there's really two reasons for this. The first is that practically everything that Augustine wrote has survived the ravages of time. And there are very few authors in antiquity for which this can be said. In fact, when we're talking about Greek and Latin literature, we generally recognize we've probably lost about 90% of what was actually written. And so this helps to put in context this notion that for Augustine, 5.1 million words that he wrote survive. So this amounts to about 130 books, about 300-ish letters, and upwards of about 1,000 sermons. So this is without really even a close second, this is the largest surviving corpus, the largest surviving body of literature of any author up to the modern era. And so as a result of this, there's actually a whole field now known as Augustinian studies. There's a whole scholarship just around Augustine's life and work. In fact, this is at Oxford, initiated by a scholar named Peter Brown. If any of you have stumbled into Augustine's biography that Peter Brown wrote in the mid-60s, Peter Brown basically, with that book and a few others that he wrote, initiated a whole new area in ancient history studies called late antiquity. Augustine basically figures as the most prominent personality, and so gets a massive amount of attention from individuals who are interested in studying this area. So we've got an enormous body of work. Basically, his whole library survived. Secondly, the book that, of course, we're going to be spending our time on, the Confessions. Augustine wrote 130 books. Most people could not name 5 or 6 of them, but the Confessions is a book that most people recognize pretty quickly. The Confessions is a world's bestseller. which in some sense we could say is this is just a book that has never gone out of print. It has been continuously copied by hand throughout the Middle Ages in the monasteries. It has been reprinted as soon as the printing press was invented. The Confessions is, of course, one of the first books in line to get printed, and it has been continuously translated into every modern language for the last 1600 years. New translations into English continue to be published, usually one about every 5 to 10 years. Someone will have a go at it. And yet, for this massive readership spanning 16 centuries, lay people and scholars come to the Confessions, they read this masterpiece, and they walk away asking the question, what is this book? What is this that I just read? And so we're going to answer this a couple of ways. The first is just to let Augustine speak for himself. This was our, I think, our splash page when we were all entering the room. But I'll repeat what we saw there. So Augustine did a lot of things that nobody had ever done before. One of the things that he did is at the end of his life, he went back and took an inventory of everything that he had ever written, and then basically wrote down what the corrections were so that posterity, when it picked up his works, would be able to look at what he thought he wished he would have said differently. This book's sometimes called Retractions or Reconsiderations. There's a conference by this name at Villanova. For our purposes, we'll refer to it as the Reconsiderations. So at the end of his life, he writes this, and he says this. He says, "The 13 books of my confessions concern both my good and my bad actions, for which they praise our just and good God. In so doing, they arouse the human mind and affections towards him. As far as I'm concerned, they have this effect on me when I wrote them, and they still do now when I read them. What others think about them is for them to say, but I know that they have given pleasure in the past, and still do give me pleasure and give pleasure to many of the brethren. The first 10 books were written about myself, the last 3 about Holy Scripture." So even in Augustine's view of the book, there is a natural division in the Confessions, somewhere around books 9 and 10. Some readers, as they're working their way through the Confessions, they struggle with this because there is this very quick shift from biographical material to Augustine just really getting out there philosophically and really working out some of his own exegetical interests in the book of Genesis. And so it's not what necessarily most people expect when they think that they're getting into Confessions. So what are the Confessions? What is this book that Augustine has written? Well, we could say this in general. The Confessions of St. Augustine is considered a classic of world literature. You don't have to be at seminary. You don't have to be in the theology department. There are individuals at Oxford who are atheists, who are Augustinian scholars. There are individuals who are philosophers of history, individuals who are philosophers of language, evangelicals, Protestants, Catholics. A lot of people respond to this book. It has its place as a classic of world literature. That cannot necessarily be said for all early Christian literature. So the Confessions is distinct in this regard. And it is recognized by everybody to be a masterpiece. The clever joke around a masterpiece, of course, is the book that everyone knows that they should read, but doesn't want to. But based on the registration here, there's obviously a lot of people that recognize it's a masterpiece and want to, which is good news for us. Nonetheless, the readership that the Confessions has enjoyed definitely exceeds anything that Augustine would have imagined or intended. Every year, new articles and books are being published. There's a journal of this. It's done in French. At one point, they were reporting about 300 to 400 new books or articles every year about Augustine and about the Confessions. So the level of interest in this book is not tapering off at all. So it is a masterpiece. It is a classic. But other than being a world classic, it's also a spiritual classic. And for our purposes, the way that we're going to come at this, we're largely going to emphasize this aspect of the book, that it is a spiritual classic. So one of the first things that we have to understand when we come to the Confessions is that the Confessions is actually an extended monologue. That's what's going on in the Confessions. This is Augustine praying to God as an audience of one, while his readers are basically permitted to just listen in. There are certain rhetorical devices that Augustine uses at the beginning of the Confessions that actually signal to us that if we're thinking about it correctly, Augustine's back is turned to us. We're coming into the room, listening to him give this prayer, but he's not looking at us. This is very much the way that the book is communicated. He almost never refers to the readers of the book. to whom this is addressed. The whole thing is being positioned as his confession. This is his confession to God, and we get to listen. But when we hear this idea of confession, naturally, the first thing that we think is the negative side of this. Oh, well, confession. This is confession of sin. But actually, in Augustine's outlook on things, the way that he was formed, the way that he read the Psalms, that's not really how he's coming at this. For Augustine, and this is actually the language of the Psalms, confession basically means praise of God. That's the fundamental definition of confession in the Latin Bible, which is the only Bible Augustine would have had really any interest in. Confiteor is I confess, but that means confession of praise. This notion of the confession of sin is really a secondary sense. This is brought home to us by the fact that within the confessions, the Psalms are actually quoted nearly 500 times. And so some scholars have looked at the confessions and said, well, the confessions is basically a giant commentary on the Psalms. It's an amplified psalter. You literally find quotations from the Psalms on every single page. Within the Psalms, confession of praise is fundamental, confession of sin is secondary. Of course, you have Psalm 50, you have the 6 or 7 Psalms that are devoted to this, but that's not the primary sense. Augustine actually ran into this as a problem in his congregation. Because he would be preaching. Like I said, we have about 1,000 of his sermons. Most of these were extemporaneous. He did have people sitting in the front rows of the church in Hippo who were jotting down quickly everything that he said. But we do have record of some of his improvisational comments to the congregation. And at one point, he makes reference to the psalm that was read during the liturgy, and he references this word, confiteor, I confess. And all the people in the church in Hippo, these North Africans, start doing this. He's like, whoa, 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 stop, no, stop. And he literally, we find this in one of the sermons, Augustine correcting their physical response to the word confess, and him saying, you're misunderstanding. That's not the basic meaning. The basic meaning is it's a confession of praise. Confession of sin is really just the secondary sense. But when we come to the Confessions, which runs 13 books, 78,829 words in Latin, this is one long confession. What this implies to us in Augustine spirituality, which I think is a fairly provable hypothesis, is that for Augustine, confession is actually a spiritual orientation. Confession is an act, but it's almost an outlook. It's almost potentially a way of living and seeing the world, a confessional spirituality. And so in this respect, I think Augustine could very much be a saint or the saint for the times that we live in. His cultural challenges remarkably mirror our own. And the things that interest Augustine, I think, interest the people that have joined this, which is, what are we looking for? We're looking for a deep interior life. We're looking for conversion as an ongoing process and not merely an event. We're looking for opportunities to speak to God and to be spoken to in the language of Scripture. This is the crux of the Confessions. This is Augustinian spirituality, and I think all of these things can address these sorts of felt needs and really serve as antidotes to the illusion that is constantly presented to us. So that's the spirit of the book. That's what's going on. But I do want to say something about its structure, and I want to be sure to leave a few minutes here for questions. So my job here, of course, is to try to serve as a guide, as a companion to working through the text of the Confessions. Okay, I will warn you, there are books on Amazon you can find that are entitled A Companion to the Confessions. Most of them are not. I have all of them. Most of them are books of scholarly articles of very nuanced stuff. There's actually only one legitimate companion to the Confessions. It was written by an Augustinian named John Quinn. That book works quite well. The point is this, though. My job is to try to set you up for success in the reading of the book by giving you a sense of the landscape before you get into it. And then as we continue to meet, to talk about the main ideas of the chapter that we've just read, and then have opportunity for Q&A together. So let me say this about the way that Confessions is structured so that nobody gets off the rails from the beginning. The first thing is this, is that Augustine is writing this book, scholars say sometime between 397 and 400. For convenience sake, I just use 397. So Augustine is writing Confessions in about 397, but at the time that he's writing, Augustine is a 43-year-old bishop. in the church. And he is describing the first 33 years of his life, 354 to 386, 387, 10 years after the fact. Because let me just say that one more time, because this is something people lose track of. He's writing in 397, he's 43 years old, but he's describing the first 33 years of his life 10 years later. That's going to help us to get a sense, because when we come into the Confessions, there's Augustine the character as a child, as a young boy, as an adolescent, as a young man, and then there's Augustine almost kind of as the omniscient narrator, the Bishop of Hippo, who's commenting on and interpreting the events of his life during those first 33 years. Well, we might ask, okay, well, it's all very clever, so why did he do this? What's the point? Well, Augustine said quite simply that his motivation was he felt like God wanted him to do this. He enjoyed writing it. He enjoyed reading himself. He said that others felt the same way. There are a number of academic theories about other things that were in the background as far as why Augustine wrote the Confessions. We'll probably spend little time on those. What is more important to recognize in the structure of the book is this. There are 13 books to the Confessions. The first half of the book, I mean, it literally breaks at about the halfway point in terms of word count. Books 1 through 9, this is largely biographical in nature. Oftentimes we hear people say, oh, Confessions, this is the first autobiography. And that's kind of right and kind of wrong. It is certainly the text where the first author in antiquity demonstrated this level of self-awareness about the stages of life and tried to say something with a definite theme about them, but it's not autobiography. And this is important. People stub their toe on this all the time. The Confessions is not strict autobiography. Like if you wanted to read the autobiography of someone who lived in the 20th century, and then you read the Confessions, you would not look at those two and say, oh, yeah, these are basically equivalent, but not equivalent at all. And the reason for this is that Augustine's approach to his life and his story is largely impressionistic. So when he's choosing the events that he wants to talk about in those first 9 books, there is a process of selectivity, but he does tell us what the process is, and he tells us what the motivation is. It's this, it's that Augustine is choosing those events in his life to highlight that he looks back to and says, okay, this was a determinative moment in my experience of the grace of God. This really is the theme of the book. And one thing that I will pop back for a second, one thing that has been worked out pretty carefully in terms of Augustine's chronology is that a couple years before he wrote the Confessions, he kind of had a mini conversion. And Augustine's life is about a series of conversions. But he actually went back and reread the Apostle Paul in earnest and had kind of an awakening to the idea of grace as, I mean, really, this whole notion of prevenient grace. This is the grace of God that comes to me before I do anything. This idea powerfully seized Augustine's mind. And when he's writing the Confessions, he's going back with that lens and he's reevaluating his life and saying, oh, okay, yeah, this person or this time or this event, all of these were part of God at the time, chasing me down in his grace, whether I knew it or not. And now he's telling the story that way. So it's impressionistic. It is a spiritual autobiography. It's not an autobiography in the contemporary sense of the word. So that's what we had to look forward to in books 1 through 9. We get to the second half. As soon as we get to book 10, something changes. What changes in book 10 is Augustine is now speaking to us as the Bishop of Hippo. He's no longer recollecting. Well, let me correct what I just said there. Augustine's never really speaking to us. This is still the confession he's making to God. But as he's making the confession to God, it's no longer what I was. It's what I am today as a bishop in the church and as someone who is still experiencing the presence of sin, as someone who's still experiencing ongoing conversion. And what does this look like? What concerns me today? And so in books 10 through 13, we get a much more seasoned reflection. And Augustine is going to tell us the problems that vex him, that concern him. He's very concerned about the problem of memory. So when we get to book 10, we're going to be jumping into what many people still look back to as one of the more interesting and still philosophically relevant discussions of memory as part of the human person. Augustine makes a statement in book 10. He says, I am my memory. We'll tackle that in more detail when we get there. When he moves on to book 10, if that wasn't enough to deal with the challenge of memory, he jumps into the issue of time. And his famous saying in book 10 is, I know what time is until somebody asks me to explain it to them. And he will spend a lot of time trying to explain it to us. But book 11 is a reflection on time. And then in books 12 through 13, Augustine goes a direction that most people don't anticipate, which is that he jumps into Genesis 1:1 and begins this massive exegetical project of explaining his understanding of what's going on in Genesis, and in a rather unique way in book 13, demonstrating how you can actually find the church through an allegorical interpretation of the first chapter of Genesis. It is actually quite clever. So that's books 10 through 13. If you've followed the chronology, and don't worry if you haven't, there's some resources I provided that should be sent out. Obviously, we've got a year to work through this, but you might ask yourself the question, well, there's a gap there. You've got 10 years, right? 387, you said the first 33 years of his life, right? But now it's 397. Well, what happens in those intervening 10 years? Well, the curious thing about the Confessions is that Augustine doesn't mention them. There's a bit of a spoiler here, but you're going to need to know this to make sense of the book. Monica dies at the end of book 9. We will get to this. There is something, I think, seismic about that experience for Augustine. And I don't think it's coincidental that the death of Monica is the end of the biographical section. And then there's 10 years of silence. And then Augustine picks back up in 397 as bishop and starts telling his story. So one of the answers to this could be that with the death of his mother, who really was the person who he looked to as fundamentally the instrument of his salvation, with her departure from this life, all of the other details might just seem superfluous to him. I think her influence was so powerful that at that point in time, there's really nothing left to say. He can just pick up where he is. But we need to say something, because we're going to wonder, well, okay, well, what happened in the 10 years intervening? Well, in the 10 years intervening, this happened. Augustine had been in Italy, and so he returns home to North Africa in 388. And when he gets there, he basically founds this kind of philosophical, semi-monastic community, and is living with this group of guys who are also theologically interested, pursuing a kind of quasi-monastic way of life for about 3 or 4 years, until he is forcibly seized and made a priest. Yes, this is how it could happen in late antiquity. You could be, if people realized how clever you were, and you showed up to the wrong church on the wrong Sunday, they might physically seize you and force you to become a priest. This is not a joke. This really happened, and you find this in some of the other writings of the monastics. They say, above all things, avoid the city and avoid the bishops. Do not get caught. This is a real thing. Well, Augustine apparently was off his guard. He got seized. They made him a priest in 391. He spent 3 or 4 years in that job, and then the person he's working for dies, and he takes over as the Bishop of Hippo, which is not not a remarkably great place in the scheme of things. North Africa was an important province to the Romans. It was still pretty wealthy, actually, while Augustine was alive. But this is not the main center. He's a little bit in the backwater in Hippo Regius. So those are the 10 years that are missing. His original audience probably would have known all of this anyway. He's writing about people and naming people, most of whom are still alive at the time that he's writing the Confessions. So they've probably kept up with his journey. So the last point I'll end on, and then I think that leaves us ample time if there are some questions. When we get to this break point in 10, I think it's worthwhile to point out that the response to this is pretty significant. Modern readers are not always in sympathy with what happens between books 9 and 10, when the biographical information stops and the serious diving into memory and time in Genesis begins. But I will say this, and I have felt that at one point, I think, in my earlier readings of it, but on repeat readings of the text, the reality that has come home to me, and this is a little bit cynical, but I think people find Augustine the sinner a little bit more interesting than Augustine the saint, and that's basically who we get in books 1 through 9. but the conviction I've come out of on repeat readings is that Augustine the Saint will actually always have more to offer us. So I'll stop there, and we can see if we've got a few questions to talk through.
Hey Kevin, this is Jim. That was fantastic. So thank you. I think I learned more about Augustine in the last 35 minutes than I have in the last several years on my own. So I'm really grateful. I'm going to ask one thing of you, maybe in a minute or two, just articulate how you envision the next series of interactions going, or what the participants should do in between now and next month and such. And then while you're articulating that, anybody who has questions for Kevin now, use the chat function on your screen. It may vary in location based on device, but for most of us, it should be along the bottom menu. And you can just hit chat, type in your question, and then we'll have somebody who will kind of curate that and get it to Kevin to give you an answer.
Okay, so looking forward then, what I've done with other groups that has seemed to work pretty well, everybody likes a one-pager, something that, okay, give me one page I can look at that just kind of sets it up. I mean, nobody wants to be given a book about a book while they're trying to get into something new. So I have put together some one-pagers on each chapter of the Confessions. Those can be made available. So what I would envision would be, there's actually a two-page document that is a quick start guide to the Confessions that I wrote that gives you about 3, 4, 5 sentences that summarizes each of the first 9 books. And part of the reason I do this is because when we're reading the Confessions, remember, this is fairly impressionistic. It's not always obvious as you're reading to see, okay, well, how old is Augustine and what is the time frame? Like, what's the timetable of book 3? He doesn't tell you. He doesn't deal with this because he's making confession to God. He knows that God knows this. He's not interested in time stamping things. So the first page is a quick start. The second page actually gives his age and the years chronologically that are being addressed in books 1 through 9. So I would say everybody who's interested in the reading should probably do the quick start guide and then have a look at the one pager, which just summarizes the basic contour of the book that we're going to read. So for next time, it'll be book 1. And then we'll get back together here. I could give a little talk about the main ideas of book 1, some of the more interesting parts, maybe some of the scholarly discussion on this, and then leave it open for questions. If that sounds good to you, that's what I was imagining.
That's super. Thank you. Madonna, yes. Are you able to? Yeah, perfect, thanks.
Sure. Okay, first question is from Tim Anderson. Hi, Tim. Tim is asking, what would you recommend as the recommended translation, and does it matter?
Yeah, great question. At one level, it doesn't really matter. I'm probably not going to be referencing page numbers as much as section numbers, and every translation of the Confessions uses the same numbering system that's been in use for hundreds of years. So I would say choose a translation that you're most comfortable with. The ones that I've tended to be most comfortable with would be Henry Chadwick's in the Oxford World Classics. That's this one that I showed you. That was my first introduction to Confessions. The Maria Bolding translation probably holds the field today as the best English translation. And I'm being serious. I'm not saying this to be pretentious, but if anybody reads French, the French edition of the Confessions is light years ahead of anything you will ever find in English in terms of its notes, and just in terms of the sheer magnitude of how well the scholarship is done in that edition. But yeah, Chadwick and Bolding are both great.
Thank you, Kevin. How many times have you, this question is from Mary to Donnie. How many times have you read the Confessions?
Oh man, in English, like all the way through cover to cover, I've lost track. I mean, there are certain parts of the Confessions I've probably read 100 times without exaggeration.
Wow.
I mean, the text that I did before I went to Oxford was a Latin edition of the Confessions. It's a reader's edition of the Confessions. So I literally read every single word of the Latin text of the Confessions and parsed every single word, and then built a spreadsheet that was unbelievably large. And yeah, I mean, I've done a silly amount of work on the text. I've actually, parts of the text I've read more in Latin than I've read in English. But this is the thing that C.S. Lewis said, which I think is pretty memorable, is that the important books to us aren't the books that we've read, it's the books that we're always reading. And this is just a book that I'm always reading.
Thank you, Kevin. We're lucky to have you. Another question from Arlene. I've never read Confessions and maybe jumping ahead, but could you speak about Augustine's early education?
Yes. Yeah, this is actually, yeah, this is well in my wheelhouse. So let me just say three things on Augustine's education. And a lot of work has been done on this. Again, Augustine is the most interesting, most important person in late antiquity. And education in late antiquity is a huge topic. If anyone's interested in bibliography on any of these, I'm happy to provide it. But the answer to the question is this. The most important thing to understand about Augustine's education is that in late antiquity, the period of time that Augustine's living, there's no such thing as Christian education. So if you are a Roman citizen and you're living as a provincial, which Augustine is, and Augustine is observing his father, who is kind of a lower class, upper class guy, which has some extraordinary financial demands and is extremely stressful. This is a life Augustine wants to escape, right? The path forward in the Roman Empire in late antiquity was through a set curriculum, which would basically, it's the classical curriculum of the trivium and the quadrivium. But Augustine would have gone to a grammar school in his hometown, and he would have literally had beaten into him, because Roman education was would be illegal in any other society, but literally had the mechanics and basics of the Latin language and Greek, which Augustine hated, beaten into him, to begin to groom him, because this was the aim of education, to groom him to ultimately take an administrative post in the Roman Empire. So Augustine's education was A, entirely Latin, B, designed to make him a rhetorical genius. Not everybody responded as well as he did, and C, to escape provincial life. So Augustine would have read 4 authors more than any others. And in fact, he references all 4 of these authors at the beginning of the Confessions and cites them explicitly. So he would have read Cicero, Virgil, Terence, and Sallust. Now, obviously, Augustine read many, many other authors. That's obvious from the City of God, it's basically an encyclopedia of Roman references. But in terms of what did he get as a child from like 5 to 10, these are the books that he would have been fed. And in book 1, he's going to make some very remarkable observations about the nature of his education. But he got same education as any pagan would. I mean, there's no distinction. There's no way to get a Christian education.
Okay, great. Thank you. You had mentioned prevenient grace as a core theme of Confessions. Could you speak more into Augustine's understanding of grace? I've heard he's also known as the Doctor of Grace. Just to sneak in one more question. Well, let's answer that one first. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so in Confessions, I think it's book 12, he actually uses the Latin word praevenio a number of times. And so this notion of the grace that comes to us before we do anything to merit it is central to Augustine. I mean, the work done on Augustine's view of grace is enormous. I will say this, I want to answer the question, but from almost any of these questions that come up, whether it's Augustine's education or his view on grace or his view on anything, if someone is kind of leans to being a really serious student on this, the book that you want is the Augustinian Encyclopedia by Alan Fitzgerald. I mean, I basically had that book open on my desk every day that I was at Oxford, because it's the starting point for all of these questions. So there's a plug for Alan Fitzgerald's amazing book. But in terms of Augustine on grace, I mean, fundamentally, Augustine saw something as grace that comes to us in an unmerited way. Augustine becomes a bit of a lightning rod at the Reformation because everybody's claiming him. And so you'll have Calvinists and Lutherans and others pointing back to Augustine saying, hey, I think I see in Augustine this idea. And this obviously generates a lot of controversy. But I think it's helpful to recognize that there are aspects of Augustine's theology of grace that definitely certain branches of the Reformation picked up on. But sometimes Augustine is, I think, erroneously kind of imagined as this like proto-Calvinist. And generally, when people are talking about the theology of grace, this is part of the topic that comes up. There are aspects of that. I mean, Augustine was very emphatic at the end of his life about God's grace in predestination. This becomes one of the later controversies at the end of Augustine's life. But fundamentally, what Augustine wanted to defend against was an error. There was a British monk. It's actually, Pelagius was the earliest British writer that we have in history. And he was a monk who's, from what would be the present day British Islands. And his notions of grace were categorically opposed to Augustine. So kind of the archetypal struggle about the nature of grace is between Pelagius and Augustine. And there's a lot. I mean, we could actually just turn this entire programming into the discussion of Augustine's view of grace. But effectively, Pelagius is saying that we can merit our salvation in some sense apart from grace, and Augustine's going to the other end of it and say, no, it's actually the opposite. We don't do anything to merit grace. That nullifies the notion of grace.
Okay, great. And this question is also from Michael Yang. Hi, Michael. Just to sneak in one more question, what other core themes should we pay attention to as we read the Confessions?
Okay, yeah, so there's, in the first 9 books, there are a couple things that come out that most people are not expecting that they're going to be confronted with. I'm not saying this in any way to discourage anyone, but there are things that Augustine's dealing with that we need to have a little bit of prior knowledge of. So one of the themes that's going to come up is that Augustine, for almost 10 years of his life, and this is part of Monica's intense distress over his son, is that Augustine joins a religious sect called the Manichees, which is, we will definitely talk about them. We'll talk about them at length when we get to like books 3 or 4. But Augustine has this philosophical conversion event when he's 18. He gets turned on to the notion of philosophy and wisdom by reading this book called Cicero's Hortensius, which is now lost. And so then he goes and he picks up the Bible and he's like, oh, I mean, this is terrible. Like, he got it in a bad Latin translation, and he sets it down and says, okay, this isn't really readable. I need something a little more elegant to help me kind of move forward in this aspiration for understanding reality philosophically. Falls in with this group called the Manicheans. Today, if we were to look at them, it would just kind of feel like a bizarre cult, like a hodgepodge of all of these different religious ideas that don't really seem like they hang together very well. But Augustine was drawn to them because they suggested to him that they could solve his theological problems without any appeal to authority. Just through reason alone, we can help you understand the problem of evil. So Manichaeism is something that we're going to have to deal with. The other is that further down in his development, Augustine reads books by, we call them the Neoplatonists. They wouldn't have called themselves. They were basically descendants of Plato, the philosophical school of Plato. But he reads these books by the Neoplatonists that actually help him to unwind his attachment to the Manichees and put him on track to be able to come to terms with the incarnation in the prologue of John's Gospel. So the Manichees, that's a theme. Augustine's encounter with Neoplatonism is another major theme. And those two really kind of dominate books 1 through 9.
Thank you, Kevin. Another question from Mark Hauk. Where is the Quick Start Guide found?
I think that's going to be sent out to everyone. So I have supplied that, but that will be, I'm not exactly sure what the mechanism will be for that getting out to everybody, but I think that will be distributed.
Yeah, Madonna. Yeah, that may be for us, Madonna, to just send to all the registrants after this. Yeah. Via email after this course, after this lecture.
Will be. And we'll also be distributing the recording. So for all of these books that Kevin is referencing, they'll be in the recording.
And just as long as I'm on mic here, I want to give a plug. Kevin referenced Alan Fitzgerald. For those St. Thomas of Villanova parishioners, that is our very own father, Alan Fitzgerald, OSA. So you may give him a pat on the shoulder as you see him at Mass on Sunday.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, another question here from James O'Neill. Not sure this is the James O'Neill I know, but if it is, hello, James. I have the FJ She translation, so having a common version would be nice.
Yeah, the She translation is solid. I guess if we were to agree as a group, or if you want me to suggest to the group what we all should use, I would say we'd probably all be best served if everyone used the bolding translation, but I don't think that's really going to be necessary.
Okay, I think some of this has already been answered, but I'll read it anyway. This is from Reggie. So in terms of structure, we are reading one book per month. Considering there are 13 books in Confessions, I'm assuming we will read 2 books in 1 month. I know the answer to that is yes. We're meeting once a month, correct? Yes. Right,
Yes.
Kevin? Any discussion questions or study guides? They will be forthcoming. And hello from New Jersey. Okay, and there's a note. I'm using Bishop Robert Barron's word on Fire Edition. Is this okay?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, we went to that question. This is from Steve. Wasn't he also a Platonist? Is that how you say that? Platonist?
Platonist. Yes.
Platonist.
Yes. Was Augustine a Neoplatonist? Yes, for sure.
Okay.
I'll try to give you the short answer on this. I mean, there's a whole book. Book 7 of the Confessions is dedicated to this subject, so we will definitely tackle this in earnest when we get there. But yes, I mean, everybody is working out of some philosophical milieu. That's not really a choice. I mean, if we're Americans, our default position is some form of pragmatism. Like we could try to consciously opt out of that, but there's just certain things that are in the air that you just don't opt out of. And maybe we're not even fully conscious of it, but Augustine was conscious of it. And Platonism or Neoplatonism was something that Christians in the 4th century began to realize they could accommodate aspects of Platonism to Christian revelation without these being in conflict with one another. And they found that Neoplatonism could solve some of their problems. So was he a Neoplatonist? Yes, but his enthusiasm for Neoplatonism definitely tapered off over time. So at the time of what's going on in book 7, he's like on fire. He's an enthusiastic Neoplatonist. But by the time you get to him writing City of God, he has some scathing critiques of certain of the Neoplatonists. So it's not really entirely accurate to say he's a Neoplatonist. I think it's probably accurate to say he's heavily influenced. That's the air that he breathed. That apparently was the air that St. Ambrose breathed, who was also instrumental in his conversion. And then, of course, there's a bunch of work has been done on this idea that in Milan, which is where Augustine's ultimate conversion took place, you actually had kind of this community of spiritual Catholics who were intellectuals, who were Neoplatonists, and they all felt like this worked out pretty well.
Thank you, Kevin. Part of this has already been answered. How many meetings? There will be 12. Is there a syllabus?
Well, I mean, the syllabus would basically be this. Next month we'll do book 1, and the following month we'll do books 2 and 3 because they're 2 of the shortest books in the Confessions. And then it'll basically be 1 book a week after, and I'm still going to have to decide where we double up on a book. It might be 8 and 9. So that's generally the syllabus. And then, as I mentioned, there'll be the 1-pagers for each book of the Confessions given out in advance.
Right. Okay. Let's see here. Betty Hollander still doesn't understand where the study guide is found. Maybe we can help her. That's what we'll be sending out, correct?
Yeah, we'll send that out. We'll send that out, Madonna, to everybody who's registered.
Okay, good.
And just noting where we are, closing in on the top of the hour here. Are there any more what I'll call substantive Augustine questions as opposed to procedural questions? Because the procedural questions we can potentially answer via email, but if there's more Augustinian spirituality or confessions questions, we have time for maybe one more.
This is more about the edition. So this Ray's edition is from J.G. Pilkington translation. Is that okay? It's
Sure.
okay.
Yep.
And more questions about the study guide. We might also mention, Jim, before we let people go, that the next 3 dates, which we will include in the email that we will send you, are February 11th, March 13th, and April 9th. Again, those dates are February 11th, March 13th, and April 9th. And I did skip over one question from Vanessa de la Cruz, but I think we answered that in terms of the translation by Maria Bolding. So, oh wait, there's one more new question. Was Augustine's son alive during the writing of the Confessions?
No, Augustine's son Adeodatus had died. It would appear he died after they returned back from Africa. So the quick chronology on that would be Augustine's conversion, and then in Easter of 388, Augustine and his best friend Alypius and Adeodatus, his son, are all baptized by Ambrose in Milan, which interesting point. The baptistry in Ambrose's cathedral has actually been excavated. So if you want to go see the baptistry where Augustine and Adeodatus and Alypius, Augustine's best friend, were baptized, you can walk around in it. This has been discovered. So a quick sidebar there. But Adeodatus was 16 when he was baptized with Augustine. We think he probably died about 2 or 3 years later.
Okay, thank you. Will there be a discussion board, or do we confer questions, comments when we meet via Zoom? We actually didn't talk about that.
That's a great question. That's one of the beautiful things about this is we're learning as we go. And so I think we'll take that as a consideration and get back to you. But candidly, I love the idea of creating a discussion board to kind of allow us as a virtual Augustinian community to continue to connect with one another in between these events. And so let us take that away as a really good idea, and come back to you guys with how we'll solve for it. But we are literally right at the top of the hour, and I do want to be respectful of everybody's time so that when we come together, we can be planful. And that's not only for the participants, but also for Kevin. And so I'll circle back to where I began. So first of all, Kevin, thank you so much. This was fantastic. And I got to tell you, like, I'm jazzed. I got my own confessions here. I've learned more in the last hour than I have in the last year about Augustine, and I'm running the lay Augustinians, and so God bless you and thank you, and Madonna and Sarah and the entire Province team. Thank you guys so much for helping us to put this together. For everyone who joined, thank you so much. This has been recorded and will be posted to our website. So if you thought it was worthwhile, please let your friends know and let them know that they can hit the video on the website. It'll probably take us a day or two to get it up. And then they can sign up and catch up for the next session and carry along with us as we go forward. I really look forward to reconnecting again in a month. And Kevin, I'll leave it to you if you have any final words or guidance for us before we sign off for the evening.
No, just thanks to everyone. Thanks to you all for hosting this and taking care of the technical side of this, and just super appreciative of the interest in the confessions. And I very much like the idea of the discussion board. So happy to be available and to be engaged with people in as much as we're able to.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you again, Kevin. Thank you again, Madonna and team. And God bless everybody. And I wish you all a good evening. Good night.